Good evening, everyone. This is Janice Kortkamp with Syria Face to Face, Episode 9. And I will talk for a little while and just do some brief introductions while people are coming online. I hope you all are doing well. It's snowing here today in Luckett's, Virginia, and we have enjoyed our winter of snow and are looking forward to a spring of not snow. Oh, hello, Stephen, Wissam, David. Oh, Yasser, this is great just to see people joining. Thanks you guys so much for coming online. Hi, George. As I said, my name's Janice Kortkamp. Just very briefly, I've been researching Syria since 2012. I think I put well over 7,000 hours into the process by this time in 2019, and have had the privilege of making 6 visits over there during the war since May of 2016. I go approximately every 6 months and spend 3 or more weeks there, traveling around as much as I can, and have been really just amazed to be able to travel around much of the country, and enjoyed meeting hundreds of Syrians, spending time with them and hearing their stories. And so I try to present in these face-to-face videos both research and my own observations, experiences, and try to make sense of things and share that with people in America and around the world. And I've been thrilled with the responses that I've been getting to these videos. And yes, Mr. Sid and maybe even Little Dog will be joining us later tonight, so welcome. Tonight I wanted to spend some time giving a brief kind of update of the current situation. And, you know, I think one of the main themes that those of us who have been researching the war against Syria have found is that it's a war on many fronts. And so I'm going to try to talk about what the current status is of the war on those various fronts and hit on all of those. Basically, we're talking militarily, politically, economically, and media through propaganda. All of those things have been employed in trying to really tear Syria apart. Initially, the goal was to take control over Syria by the U.S. and its allies, but really it has morphed into what is called Plan B. Even John Kerry referred to Plan B, which is to separate Syria into smaller states and to really weaken it and destroy it as a nation that way. So we're going to talk about those things tonight, but I wanted to start it with a story from Damascus on a recent visit. Let me catch my breath. You know, I don't even decide the topic. I think all week about these videos and what to share with you, and I don't really even decide on a topic actually till about Thursday, and it's usually about 3 o'clock on Sunday that things start coming together in my mind. And so if it seems not quite polished or particularly organized, I'm sorry, that's why. But really what I want these to be is just dialoguing with you and discussing these things. So hopefully it'll make some sense. But this story is from Damascus, as I said, and I was there with a very dear friend. Really, I think of her as my sister. And we've spent quite a bit of time together in Syria. She is, her sons, she had 3 sons. They all joined the army. One was killed in Daraa early on in the war, and she wears a picture of him on a gold necklace that she wears all the time, every day, all night. And she doesn't speak very much English, and I speak less Arabic, you know, just a few words and phrases. And yet somehow we managed to have, between, you know, facial expressions and what we're saying with our eyes and our hands, and with the help of Google Translate, we talk for hours and hours. And I think, you know, just mom to mom, human to human, and she is just so, that friendship is so very precious to me. And we were talking about her son who had been killed in the war, and we were both really upset and just so sad. And she was the one in Damascus that just looked at me in the eyes and said, why, Janice? Why is this happening? And in the context of the conversation, we'd been talking about what the U.S. had been involved with in manufacturing this fake rebellion, this fake revolution, bringing this violence and chaos to Syria. And just her words and her tears, was really, all I could say is, we both know. And these are things that we've talked about before, the various reasons why the U.S. decided to take down Syria, for our greed and arrogance, wanting to control the region. For Israel, it's been a plan of Israel's for a long time to take down Syria and weaken it so that it could not provide any kind of defense for itself, but also defense for the region against Israel's hopes of expansion and plans of expansion, about Saudi Arabia and their role, about Turkey and its role, Qatar, all these various factions that have been involved, and as well as the UK and France and other Western countries. But really, when you know what the situation is, it's so hard to accept that any of those reasons would make any human being do what has been done against Syria and the Syrian people. As we were talking, hello everyone, there's a lot of people there, and thank you, I see many friends. She and I were talking, a young lady came over who was in her early 20s, very lovely girl, and she said she had overheard our conversation, and she speaks English and wanted to introduce herself and talk with us for a while. And of course, we invited her to sit down. And she said, I'm from a town called Maharda in the northern part of the Hama governorate, which is a province that borders Idlib. And we'll talk about that as we go on tonight. And she was sharing with us about how her town had been under attack throughout the course of the war. It's a Christian town. It's about 22,000 people now. And, at various times they've been really under siege, surrounded by terrorist groups. They have been constantly attacked by mortars. In September of 2018, they were actually attacked by terrorist groups from Idlib using Grad missiles and cluster bombs in those Grad missiles, and it was a horrific massacre, but it's not the first one that they've seen in Maharda. And I was so touched to meet her, and that was before this last attack that I just spoke about with the Grad missiles and the cluster bombs that killed, I think, oh gosh, my brain just stopped of the number of casualties there, but it was horrific. And I was looking through the pictures of the victims, and I don't know. I don't think it's the same girl. She looks very similar. When I was reading the description of her as a person, it sounded a lot like her. I am hoping that it was not her that was killed in that last attack. I'm trying to find out for sure. But for me, she represents all of the people of Maharda who have suffered so much through this terrible war. So I want you to remember the name of that town. It's representative of many villages and towns, and of course the cities in Syria that have been attacked, under siege. Many towns and many villages massacred. And so it's representative of what has been occurring there for the last 8 years because of the U.S. and our allies' desire to take control of Syria or to rip it apart if we couldn't outright control it. So don't forget Maharda. We'll talk about that more as we go. So we're talking tonight again about a military update, the various fronts of the war, military, economic, political, and the propaganda. And they're all kind of intertwined, so it's hard to just say, well, we're talking about the military now, we're talking about the political now, because everything is just so connected, interconnected. Most of the focus now, of course, is on the northern stretch of Syria. This is a huge, long border. It's the border between Syria and Turkey. It stretches for about 500 miles. Some of it is exceedingly, most of it, I think, is very difficult terrain. And none of that border right now, it really is controlled by the Syrian armed forces and the Syrian government. It's controlled, if you split your screen and look at a map of Syria, it might be easier. But it's controlled by Turkey in the far northeast in a little area called Afrin that they took over from Kurdish groups. And it's controlled by terrorists that hold Idlib, which is a large province that's on the border between Syria and Turkey in the northwestern part of the country. And then going further east, it's controlled by the U.S. mercenary Kurdish forces and, of course, the U.S. presence there. So that entire border with Turkey is under various different forces. And I put a link to Stephen Sahuni's article, which is an excellent summary of that northern situation right now. But basically what we have is, we'll talk about Idlib first. Idlib is a large province that's in that northwestern area of Syria. And it is controlled by tens of thousands of armed fighters. And, you know, the numbers, it's very difficult, like I said before, to get totally accurate numbers. I'm seeing a lot of people from Syria, and this is just, it is wonderful to see you all. And please add your comments as I speak, because you're the voices that people really need to hear from. Idlib is controlled by between 50 and 70,000 or more are these armed fighters. All of the area is basically dominated by Al-Qaeda at this point. There are also a lot of other terrorist groups there. The second largest group, I would say, is backed by Turkey. And then you have Chinese Uyghurs. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Everything, I read everything, so I don't often hear the pronunciation. But there are like 20,000 Chinese radicals there that have moved in with their families, and they are terrorists. They teach their children how to be terrorists. And this goes along with other headlines we're reading about from China about these supposed camps that are so horrible. But what China is really doing is trying to deprogram radicalized Muslims that have been infected by Wahhabi and Muslim Brotherhood teaching so that they don't become terrorists there in such a large part of China. So this is the situation in Idlib. Now, when these terrorist groups first took over Idlib, they literally drove out religious minorities from the area, and they imposed, each group imposed its own interpretation of Sharia law, which, an extremist, fundamentalist, violent form of Sharia law. Sharia law is just Islamic law, and it can take many forms, but this is what can only be described by anyone who's not one of them as a terrorist, basically, setup of government. And so each group had its own situation. But over the course of time, groups have been absorbed by other groups, and they've all come under domination basically by Al-Qaeda. Even the U.S. Special Envoy regarding Syria, who has never stepped foot in government-held Syria, which is, of course, most of the country, never talked to Damascus, etc., he said that Idlib is the largest stronghold of Al-Qaeda that exists on the planet. So needless to say, Syria wants to defeat the terrorist groups that are holding Idlib. Many of the terrorists there are still getting, obviously, and even more so, supported by Turkey. And this is where those Grad missiles came from, to attack Maharda and slaughter that town, the people of that town. And of course, Al-Qaeda, which is supported by various governments in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. So you have a big mess in Idlib, and the Syrian armed forces are getting ready to launch their offensive to take back this huge area of their country from all of these terrorist groups. And that was put on hold for several months because of negotiations that were going on between Turkey and Russia and Iran that resulted in ceasefire agreements. And this was in hopes of creating more of a political solution for how to handle this terrorist caliphate that's in the shoulder of Syria. But what has been happening, of course, is the terrorists actually, have violated those ceasefire agreements many times and are really ramping up more and more attacks. Maharda, the town that I've been talking about, is under greater threat and attack now. They've had several attacks on them. Various areas in the Hama countryside have been suffering from terrorist attacks. There was, I think it was today or yesterday, there was an attack by the terrorists against Syrian Arab army positions. There were many martyrs of Syria in that battle, but they did manage to kind of beat back the terrorist attack. So there are all kinds of things happening there, but correct me if I'm wrong, you guys who are in Syria, I'm just feeling like the momentum is building. And finally, and hopefully, the offensive against the terrorists in Idlib will begin. As I said, the rest of the border across the northern border between Syria and Turkey is controlled by the Americans and their Kurdish mercenary forces that are called the Syrian Democratic Army. There was actually a video, I think it was a general of the U.S. Army, might have been a colonel, one of the spokesmen, he was talking to a group and kind of laughingly discussing how they came up with the name Syrian Democratic Forces. It's just a name. It has nothing to do with what is going on in that almost 1/3 of Syria that is controlled by the 100% illegal U.S. occupying forces. So this is what President Trump was talking about, was getting the American troops out of Syria and kind of leaving the situation. He wanted to leave the situation to Turkey, which is a recipe for total disaster. But there's this huge area of land that's basically under the control of the American illegal occupation. And you're seeing a lot of headlines about how it's the last fight against ISIS and they're finally wiping out all of ISIS. I don't believe a word of it. There was a story recently about the U.S. Taking literally tons of gold from ISIS that they've been accumulating. I don't know if that's true, although the sources are fairly reputable that are talking about that. And we've seen that happen, of course, in Libya and Iraq. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. But there's a lot of games being played. There are some battles, I guess, between the Kurdish forces, perhaps, and ISIS. I can't really confirm or deny that. But in any event, everything was supposed to be winding down. But the great and grand military industrial intelligence community complex, working in conjunction with the Israeli special interest groups and the Israeli government, have kind of put the kibosh on that plan of totally taking out American troops. And in fact, now we're talking about, a certain number of troops that will stay there and protect the border or whatever. The U.S. needs to get out of Syria. I've said this again and again. We have no business being there. We are not there under any international law or our own law. We are a totally rogue force in Syria that is not wanted by the Syrian people and is not wanted by the Syrian government and is only wanted by certain groups of Kurdish militias that want to carve out some of Syrian land for their own little landlocked country that will be forever at the mercy of Turkey and every other force in the region. It is nonsense. Kurds are Syrians if they live in Syria, and they can be Syrians and live in Syria like the rest of the many different ethnic groups that comprise the Syrian population. What you've heard about the Kurds and how they deserve their own country, that is all U.S. Israeli propaganda designed to get people to support this idea of breaking Syria up into smaller countries. And it has nothing to do, the U.S. and Israel couldn't care less if every Kurd person in Syria dies. They do not care about the Kurds. They do not care about their cause. They betrayed them in Afrin, of course, when Turkey took over that area. They've betrayed them in Iraq since the 1980s. There is absolutely no evidence or basis on which to think that the U.S. cares about the Kurds or their cause. And it's not all the Kurds. The Kurds are not unified, as I've said before. There are different groups that have different alliances and different objectives. And Kurds live all around in Syria. Some are fighting in the Syrian Arab Army, for example. I've met many in Damascus and other areas of Syria, and they support their army and Syria as a nation, and do not support this idea of separating into their own Kurdish country. And in fact, many of those Kurd militias have gone through in areas that they have taken control of. These are the ones directly supported by the U.S., have in fact been ethnically and religiously cleansing the areas that they've been in. Those areas, there are many different groups there, and some of these Kurd militias that we call the Syrian Democratic Forces have literally been, cleansing their areas so that they will be purely Kurd, etc. This should not be supported. The U.S. has done terrible damage in Syria, and we need to get out of their country. So I'm hoping this makes sense as far as the military situation. If you want to help Syria, contact your representatives, whether you're in the U.S. or in Britain or wherever you're in, and tell them to get out of Syria, the U.S. and its coalition forces. So we were talking about the military situation. The other situation that I wanted to talk about tonight is the economic situation. And right now, as I said, war has been waged against Syria on several different fronts, and one of the most severe has been the economic front. Going way back years even before the war started, there were economic sanctions put on against Syria. And as the violence began there, more and more sanctions were added. And what has happened is the Syrian government, the Syrian army with their allies have liberated most of the country. So the country is returning to stability, safety, of course, secularism, where all religious groups are protected and respected. Women have basically equal rights, as I've said many times, and they are not required to wear any, hijab or burqa or anything. They walk around in shorts and tank tops if they want to, or jeans and sweatshirts or what have you. So that's the situation in most areas of the country. And what is happening is, in those areas that were the ones that suffered damage, they're trying to rebuild their country, their infrastructure, their hospitals, their schools, their homes, of course, businesses, churches, mosques, etc. They're trying to rebuild their country, and they are in the process of doing that. But what the U.S. sanctions do is, because it's not just the U.S. forces its allies and other countries to participate in these sanctions. It basically lays an economic siege around Syria. So, for example, you cannot get investment from any Western country. If you want to go to Europe, for example, and get investment to build factories or to rebuild a hospital or what have you, you actually are not able to do that. It's against international, these sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S. If a country tries to help Syria with investment, they will get sanctioned and they will get punished economically. So it's kind of this bullying tactic. So it makes investment, particularly for large projects, almost impossible unless the Syrians go to China or Russia. Russia doesn't have all that much money to be able to do that kind of investing. China is helping, but the Syrian people, although they appreciate that, really want to have, business relations with Western businessmen in Western countries for investment and development, and they cannot actually do any of that. Even, if I had money, I wouldn't put it in the stock market right now. If it was legal, I would point out small businesses in Syria, because I know those people. They're brilliant, they're hardworking, they're productive, they're inventive, and I would invest in small businesses in Syria to help the people there. But it's literally, even if I had money, I could be put in jail as an American citizen for investing in any business in Syria. So that's part of the economic sanctions and the horrific effect that they have, which is literally the U.S. is trying to prevent Syria from being able to rebuild. Other ways they affect the Syrian people that are kind of, we just wouldn't think of them as being from the West, but they can't have PayPal accounts. They can't have bank accounts. There's no bank transfer allowed to go into Syria. They can't do GoFundMe. If they have a business and they want to promote it on Facebook, they can't even boost a post, literally, because you have to have a credit card, an international credit card, and those, because of the sanctions, are impossible in Syria. So let's say you have someone who's a brilliant translator, Arabic to English or Arabic to French or what have you. They literally cannot. They could actually have a cottage business, a home-based business in Syria, and do that work and make good money doing that, but it is illegal because of the U.S. sanctions. Another thing makes the sanctions make impossible. Before the war, many firms, and for example, hospitals especially, invested in Western technology. I went to one magazine and they print a lot of what they do is like fashion and culture magazines, glossy, full color spreads, etc. And they had invested in these very expensive Western made printers. But because of the sanctions, they weren't able to get ink or replacement parts. They finally worked out a deal. They can get some, non-brand replacement parts through China, but the quality just is not the same. And it's quite a laborious thing to get those goods into the country. But the medical equipment, I've been to several hospitals in Syria and talked to the administrators, doctors, nurses, etc. there. And they, for example, bought CAT scans and MRI equipment from Western companies, American, German, etc. They cannot get replacement parts for those. So because of U.S. sanctions, people aren't able to get the kind of medical help they need. And this country's at war. They have had not only the regular illnesses and traumas that everybody has, but they've had all those horrific traumas and injuries and everything to deal with because of the war. But it's very hard to get these parts to be able to provide the good medical care. One of the things that you hear in Syria all over the place is Syrians make a way, and they have managed over the years to be able to get some of their equipment to keep it working. I'm supposed to call Sid now to let him know it's time to start getting his stuff ready. But all of these problems have added up, and of course we've talked about how the sanctions prohibit certain chemotherapy drugs from getting in, transplant medications, high-end prosthetic devices for people who've lost limbs. Syria can produce many on their own, but some of the more advanced, the newer types, they are unable to get. So this just kind of adds up. And now this winter especially, it's been brutally cold in Syria. They've had a very hard year there. And fuel for heating and for cooking has been very difficult and expensive to get. And this is affected by sanctions as well. Because the U.S. forces in that northeastern area, a lot of that is the larger oil wells and in the Syrian country. But they've actually, if I'm understanding it correctly, had to import fuel, liquefied gas to use as fuel for heating and cooking, etc. And the prices have gone up, and they're more scarce now than ever. I read one report that said that we're actually the U.S. is prohibiting Iran from bringing in gas to Syria. I'm checking up on that now, but that was from an excellent source, and that's probably correct. So we're not only, keeping them from getting the level of medical care that they need, investment and for development and reconstruction, but we're literally, people have been freezing to death in Syria because of this. So again, if you want to help the Syrian people, tell the U.S. to get out and all its coalition forces, and for God's sake, tell our governments to end these sanctions. They're horrific, punishing sanctions that punish the Syrian people, and we're literally punishing the Syrian people for not going along with our plan to turn their country into a terrorist caliphate. That's kind of the bottom line, is we're punishing the good people of Syria because they refuse to capitulate to our terrorist rebels. So there you have it, folks, the kind of the U.S. plan in a nutshell. In addition to the military operations, the continuing war militarily against Syria, the continuing economic warfare that's actually increasing and making Syrians' lives more difficult. The third area, of course, is politically. I was meeting with a member of the Syrian parliament, and he is responsible. He goes to all of the Geneva talks, the Sochi talks, the Astana talks, but he's very involved with the representatives of the United Nations in all this routine about changing Syria's constitution. Let me just remind you that Syria has had a constitution since the 1920s. And it's been modified through the years. It's a civil constitution. It is not based on Sharia law. It is not based on anything but what we would recognize as a civil constitution. And this was modified and ratified, popularly ratified. It was voted on by the Syrian people to accept it in 2012 that included quite a number of important reforms. So Syria has a constitution. What I wanted to remind you about is Saudi Arabia, the best forever friend of America in the Arab world that we cannot ever seem to sell too many weapons to, that we are helping the Saudis right now, slaughtering and starving Yemen to death. Saudi Arabia, who doesn't have rights for women, they still have women activists in prison for asking to drive. When they've given that right to some women in Saudi Arabia, it doesn't seem to be much of a general law that's being respected. But they still have women in jail for wanting to drive, where in Syria, they're jet pilots and they own taxi companies, and, they're engineers designing roads, etc. So it's Saudi Arabia. I always say it's the winner of the most ISIS-like government in the world award. That's kind of how I describe that government. They do not have a constitution. Their constitution simply states our constitution is Sharia law. Well, Syria has a civil constitution, and the U.S. Diplomatic team and the West European Union diplomatic team are forever trying to control what's in Syria's constitution. And as I was talking to this member of parliament, who's one of the negotiators about all this, he said, yeah, what they're trying to do is do diplomatically what they haven't been able to succeed at militarily, and that is to undermine the Syrian leadership of President Assad and the Syrian government, and to create a situation where groups like the Muslim Brotherhood can come in and grab power. So this is how dirty, that's just one tiny aspect of how dirty the behind the scenes or the politics, the political war has been against Syria. But I have to tell Sid it's his time to come. So we've talked about the military, we've talked about the economic warfare, we've talked a little bit about the political warfare, and now we're going to talk about the propaganda warfare. And in fact, in some ways, this has been so incredibly brutal, because the American people in Europe, Australia, Canada, everywhere have been told nothing but lies about the Syrian war. I want to take you back to the town of Maharda. Here we have this happens to be a Christian town, but it's happened to other towns all over Syria of different groups. constantly under siege by terrorists, constantly attacked by terrorists, massacres that have taken place there by terrorists, and never really discussed in Western media. So this is one of the clues that you know you're getting fed propaganda, is because the media sympathy is only for certain people in Syria. The tears for children are only for certain children in Syria. This is how your emotions are played with to get you to support, to get good people to support bad wars. The New Yorker magazine recently ran an article describing Idlib, this terrorist caliphate in the shoulder of Syria that is dominated by Al-Qaeda. They ran an article that's called Idlib, Syria's last bastion of freedom. This was just recently. The last bastion of freedom. This terrorist paradise where they've religiously cleansed Christians and Alawites and Shiites and Druze and everybody else from their area, where, many Sunnis have left because the horrific situation, this terrorist mentality that took over that area. And here we have the New Yorker magazine calling that the last bastion of freedom in Syria. Absolutely horrific, abysmal lies that have been told to you. As I keep bringing up Maharda, I want to mention the reporting of Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett. And these two ladies have been to Maharda. They have interviewed the survivors there of these various attacks. They have talked extensively with the local militiamen, the local militia that was formed to protect the town from the terrorists, and the civilians. And I've linked two of their articles about it in the description of this video, and I urge you to read it. And, I want to caution you because the testimonies, the stories that they got from the people there will rip you apart. They did me anyway. And I've heard some stories in Syria. The stories of the people of Maharda are the stories of people all over Syria. And so I urge you to read the wonderful reporting of those two ladies and to really share those and really try to help anybody you know understand what a horrific crime against humanity, the war crimes that have been committed against Syria. Of course, I've shared many stories of similar atrocities, but I have a friend here in the U.S. She's Syrian. She's from a town, a village very similar in that same area as Maharda. And she came over here to the States to study medicine. She's actually a practicing doctor here in the U.S., but her family is all back in Syria at their little village. And this is the village that, as the terrorist groups were moving in through Latakia in the summer of 2013, what has been called the rampage through Latakia, her village was one of the ones that was massacred there. They beheaded the local priest. They raped many of the women before they cut their heads off. Of course, they executed most of the men. And this is, this is what the Syrian people, this is what the Syrian army, this is what the Syrian president has been fighting. Literally hundreds of thousands of armed militants that if they were living in the neighborhood next to yours, you would call them terrorists, and you would want your army and your president to do whatever it took to get those people defeated and get them out of your country or dead. Honestly, if they were in the neighborhood next to yours, any human being, any rational human being would be wanting them defeated and destroyed. And most of the Syrian people, the great majority of Syrian people, are not just rational, but they're awesome. And they want their country to be free. They want their country to be better. They want reforms in the government. But they want their Syria. They want their safe, stable, secular, women-empowering Syria that loves life, loves family, and loves joy, loves traveling, loves, being a part of the world. We can't allow them to continue to be a pariah nation because of the greed and ambitions of the US and Israel and UK and France and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, etc. It has to end. So I just thank everyone for the pressure that you've been putting on to get people aware and awake about this situation. And I hope I made some sense tonight. And here is Mr. Sid, actually, and Little Dog, to finish us up tonight with a little bit happier stuff.
Happy. Here we are. Are you happy?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I'm happier now.
Give me a kiss. Hi. Well, we do a little feature every night. And tonight we're doing tabbouleh. And as a kid, I'll tell you what parsley was. You'd get a sprig of parsley on the edge of a dish. And it had to have been good for a lot of things, but one of which was never eating. And I remember hearing a comedian one time talk about parsley and how the object was, when someone wasn't looking, to take the piece of parsley that was on your dish and put it on their plate. And, by the end of the meal, somebody would have like 6 pieces of parsley on their plate because nobody would eat the parsley. So you run into tabbouleh, or tabbouleh runs into you, is really what happens, because you go somewhere and then it's like, so-and-so made tabbouleh.
Yeah.
And when that is said, kind of a gentle hush or a comes into the air, because they didn't just whip it together. It is true tabbouleh. Is a very slow pain. You shop. You get fresh parsley. You get your fresh tomatoes. You get your fresh cucumbers. You bring it home. You perform whatever ceremonial thing you do before you make tabbouleh. You wash, clean, and then it's and I have one friend who, when he presents tabbouleh to me, literally, it's like, wait, and then pours the olive oil on, literally. I said, okay, now you can eat it. And so,
wow.
Here we have, watch it slide off the plate. That'll be awesome. Here we have a plate of, it's dripping tabbouleh. And it's on a lettuce leaf. It's finely diced parsley with tomato and onion and bulgur. And I know in our diet, bulgur does not come in. Where does bulgur come in? but it's, and we were making tabbouleh earlier in the summer, had fresh parsley. And it's like, doctor, I got parsley. Can you make tabbouleh? And she's like, do you have bulgur? And I couldn't even understand the first 3 times she said it. I finally went, oh, bulgur. No, we don't have any bulgur. You can't make tabbouleh. Well, we made tabbouleh without bulgur, so it was a, and then once you eat tabbouleh, then for the rest of the broadcast, you'll have wonderful green flecks on your teeth.
Yes.
So it's not about beauty or glamour. And real good tabbouleh is light years different from just parsley in a bowl with onions.
Don't get it at your local grocery store unless you have an Arab market or something close by. This is from a local Lebanese restaurant that just opened in our town, which is delicious.
I give this 4 1/4 stars.
Really? Interesting. Yeah, they're
maybe 4.
delicious. You know, I think that actually brings home a point to me. You know, recipes have ingredients and so do wars. And it's a lot of ingredients and it's a process. And, you know, unfortunately, the US, the CIA, everybody has the recipe and the process down to a science now. And this is what we're seeing not only in Syria, but in much of the world. And I think, actually, we're a little bit early tonight, but I think we're going to finish up early.
No, we're good. We're good. Little dog has something he wanted to say.
Oh, okay. Oh, dinner and a show, I guess.
Will you sing for me? Come on and sing for me.
We're going to be terrible when we get grandkids. Absolutely unable to do for human consumption. Well, that's all for tonight, folks. And I hope that you have a wonderful Sunday evening. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, I'll answer every comment and question either tonight or tomorrow morning or sometime tomorrow. And I really appreciate you so much for joining in and adding your comments and sharing these videos. Like, again, we've just been really so encouraged and we're so thankful for all of the support. Have a wonderful evening, and from all of us here in Lucas, good night.